With the help of Hashem, we are learning Rosh Hashana Daf Chaf Tes. We left off on Daf Chaf Ches, Daf Koyach, Amid Beis, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid, in the beginning of the line. We will firstly further clarify this Shita. Let's go with Shita Rava, that mitzvahs ein tzrichos kavana, and how that does have a relationship, but not exactly with the violation of Bal Tosef, whether to violate Bal Tosef, do you need to have kavana or not? We're going to learn Rabbi Zera, who holds mitzvahs tzrichos kavana. In other words, it's a machlokas amiroyim. The Gemara is going to conclude the sugya by pointing out that really it's a machlokas tanoim. So it's a machlokas tanoim, a machlokas amiroyim. We're going to see it's a machlokas rishonim. It's going to go all the way down into halacha. This question whether mitzvahs tzrichas kavana or ain't tzrichas kavana will speak out bekitzer that halacha generally we will paskin that for mitzvahs the oiraisa you need kavana, and for the rabbanans you do not need kavana. We're going to start a new Mishnah on Daf Chavtes that is actually a Mishnah that begins with Haggadah. The link will be speaking about kavana, and don't forget the sugya of kavana wasn't only in the Gemara; it was the Mishnah that spoke about kavana. If you went by a shul and you heard the shofar and kivein liboy, whatever kavana means, even though we learned yesterday that kavana means just make sure you're paying attention that it's a sound of a shofar and not a sound of an animal. But there is a certain minimum amount of kavana that's needed l'kula alma for it not to be misasek, as we spoke out yesterday. So we're going to speak about kavana in a broader sense. Kavana meaning su'u mare melechem, the importance of looking up, not begashmias looking up, but looking at Hashem, how that mamish lifts up our lives. And the Mishnah is going to bring 2 examples in the Chumash where there was an importance of looking heavenward. And then the Mishnah is going to speak about who is qualified to blow a shofar for another. And b'chlal, there's a general rule that one cannot cause another to discharge their obligation if the one who's causing it himself or herself is not obligated. I have the halachic power to be moitze you if I'm a chuyev. Now, we're going to go into beautiful details in the sugya. There's a concept called arvus, kol Yisrael arevim zeh bozeh, which means that even after I fulfilled my obligation today, since you did not fulfill your obligation, and I'm an arev for you, I'm responsible for you, so I also didn't fulfill my obligation, which is why even after I did a mitzvah for myself, I can still do a mitzvah for you, with an exception. If I made a bracha for me, and you did not make a bracha, and let's say you don't know how to make a bracha, right? So Shemaya Ko'ina, I can make it for you. If I already discharged my obligation, there's no arabus by Birchas Hanahenen, because you don't eat and don't make a bracha. You're not mechuyev to eat. You're not mechuyev to have hana, unlike mitzvahs. And the question will be regarding kiddush, like the boire priyagofen of kiddush. What's the kiddush part of kiddush? Of course, I can make for you even after I made it for myself. But in the kiddush, we also make a boire priyagofen. And if I already made kiddush, could I be moitzi you or not? That will be the question. And the Gemara concludes that you could. You know, everyone knows here in the Chabaros, that's what we do the whole time. You make kiddush, another Jew walks into the shul, you make kiddush again. That's the sugya of Chavtes Amud Beis. That will basically conclude the 3rd chapter, and we will begin, God willing, the 4th chapter. That's going to speak about blowing shofar when Rosh Hashana falls out on Shabbos. In the Beis Hamikdash, they blew it, not outside the Beis Hamikdash. After the Churban Beis Hamikdash, Rabbi Yechanan ben Zakkai made an enactment for us not to forget that in the Beis Hamikdash, they blew the shofar even on Shabbos. They should blow it in a Beis Din. Question is it only the Beis Din of 71? Is it also in a Beis Din of 23? And we're going to learn about Gezeda de Rabba and much, much more. Let us start again on Daf Chav Ches Amid Beis, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Baruch atah Adino, Eloheinu melech haolam, sha'ar kol nivra. Wow. All right, Rava Omar. Now, we were running yesterday. The sugya began by quoting Rava Omar Zois Oimeres Hatukeya L'Shir Yotzim. That's on Daf Chav Ches. And we spoke out that the Rosh is Goyres Rabba Omar. The reason why the Rosh has the version that this whole shita of mitzvahs Ein Tzrichas Kavana came from Rabba is because of the statement. Because if it would have been Rava that would have made the statement, even though he's going to tweak it, he's going to clarify it, but you don't begin with Rava Amar. Rabbi Amr is like a new statement. So that's why he holds that the Rabbi was the one that said across the board that mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana, and therefore the Gemara said Bal Toisif will also not need kavana. But then we added this nuance that Bal Toisif doesn't need kavana if you're violating Bal Toisif bismanoi. If it's shaloi bismanoi, so Rava Amar like this: Lot says loy boya kavana. To fulfill a mitzvah, you don't need kavanah. And just to make it clear again, we spoke at the south yesterday. If I am misasik, like if I eat matzah and I'm not even mindful that I'm eating matzah, or if I hear the sound of the shofar, I'm not paying attention to the point that someone later will ask me, what did you hear? I heard a sound. I don't know, maybe it was a chamoy, maybe it was a shofar. You don't even know what you heard, then you're not yoitz. You have to know what you're hearing. I heard the sound of the shofar, but I did not have in mind to be yoitze the mitzvah. Says Rava, you're yoitze anyways. It's yoitze. Mitzvahs don't need kavanah. La'avor means if a person is doing the bal toisif, if I'm adding to the mitzvah, and many examples of that, but we'll speak out the example again. The example again will be that what happens if I sleep in the sukkah on the 8th day? I didn't do it for the mitzvah of sukkah, and there is no mitzvah. There's an aveda to add to the mitzvah. Stam, I slept there. La'avoid boya kavana is if I slept in the sukkah or I ate in the sukkah on the 8th day, l'shei mitzvahs sukkah, then I violated bal toisef. If I stam sleep there because it's convenient, I won't violate. But you know why? Because it's the 8th day. The Gemara says, how can you say that? Quickly going back to that Mishnah, if you have bloods from different karbanos, b'char, let's say, and an oila. So Rabbi Yeshua says you can only sprinkle the blood once. You may not sprinkle it shtaim shein arba, because if you'll sprinkle it shtaim shel arba, you're violating bal toisef. Why are you violating bal toisef? You're not sprinkling the b'char 4 times. You're only sprinkling the oila. You're not doing it for the mitzvah of the b'char. So Elo Amar Rava, Lot says, Loi Boya Kavana, ever. La'avoid, it depends. Last line in the Amid. If it's Bismanoi, like we learned yesterday, my friends, even after the Kohen sprinkled the dam of this Bechar, if you are a Kohen in the Beis HaMikdash, you have to be at service. If another Jew is going to bring to you a Bechar today, later, you will have to do that Avoida again. So during the daytime, the whole day is called the time to bring dam. It's called bismanoi. That's why loy boya kavana. Verstehst? Kol yom is money. That's why Rabbi Yeshua holds that if you have matan achas in matan dalid, you can't sprinkle it more than once, because if you do that, you're going to violate bal toisef because it's bismanoi. But shaloi bismanoi, the 8th day, there's no mitzvah. That's why boya kavana gevaldik. And therefore, similarly, just going back to the other case we learned yesterday, that if a Kohen gave birchas kahana, even after he finished the whole bracha, while he's standing on the platform, if he's going to add even a beautiful bracha of the Torah, he's violating bal toisef. It's shaloi bismanoi, it's bismanoi. Why is it bismanoi? Because if another community that didn't duchen yet will ask him to duchen, either he's obligated to duchen or at least he's allowed to go duchen. He's not done with the mitzvah. Still bismanoi. That's why this bal toisef. Okay. Atkan, shitas rabba, that mitzvah is even without kavanah, you fulfill the mitzvah. And just to repeat again, that in Hasidus, we have a deeper understanding of kavanah that's not related to the sugya. In other words, the ideal, according to Rabba, avada, it's better to do a mitzvah, l'shem mitzvah. But we're not focusing on something even higher. What's even higher? That when you're doing it l'shem mitzvah, you should do it with real avas Hashem, with real yiras Hashem. That is this topic we have in Chassidus about if you don't have kavanah, the mitzvah doesn't like parcha la'ela. The whole Zohar, the Alter Rebbe quotes that if a person has a kavanah, then it goes that if the av and yira are natural, it goes to the elam hayitzira. The ruchni is nika mitzvah. If a person has av and yira that they made on their own avodah through his bainanus, it goes to the elam habriya v'chulei. Okay, now Amar le Rab Zeda l'shamoye. The Gemara is going to bring a story to prove that Rab Zeda argues with Rabba. Rab Zera holds mitzvahs need kavanah. How do we know that? Because he once told his attendant, Daf Chav Te'ez, ikavan v'takali. No, Rab Zera was not the blower. Rab Zera was the listener. He told his attendant, when you blow the shofar, have specific kavanah for me. Now, what is that ayah shleima that mitzvah tzrichas kavanah? Oh, so look at the Gemara. Alma, we see he holds that this is step number one. Then we're going to go step number two. That mashmiya boya kavanah, the blower has to have kavanah not only for the blower, not only he has to have the kavanah for the listener. So now let's go like this. If the blower or the enabler requires intent, I'm blowing it for you means for your mitzvah, for you. If there's no mitzvah, why am I blowing it for you? So imagine if I'm blowing it for you, I have to have in mind that you should fulfill your mitzvah. Avada, the listener who hears, has to have in mind he's doing it l'shem mitzvah. Okay, one is built on top of the other. It's so simple, the Gemara doesn't have to speak it out. But don't forget that Rab Zera's verbal statement was not mitzvah tzrichas kavanah, was that the mashmiya has to have in mind specific kavanah for the listener. So the Gemara says, how can that be? Meisvei. We learned in our Mishnah, that's how the whole sugya began. That someone is walking behind the shul. He's not going there to hear mitzvahs. He's walking from point A to point B. He happened to walk by the shul. And this person happened to hear the entire sounding of the shofar. And the same thing will be Oikoil Megillah, right? Daf Chavtes Amadalef, 4 or 5 lines from the top of the Amid. Im kiven liboy yotza. The imlav lo yotza. And what does that mean? V'chi kiven liboy frek the Gemara. Even if the listener had kavana, how will that help? If Rab Zera holds that the mashmiya has to have kavana for the listener, hey, the blower didn't even know someone is walking behind the shul. He didn't see him. So how can Rab Zera say that the blower, the mashmiya, has to have kavanah for the listener? So the Gemara says that's not a kasha. Because the Mishnah is speaking about who was blowing the shofar, who reads the Megillah, the shliach tzibur. The shliach tzibur, including Rab Zera, never meant he has to have specific kavanah for the Uvin, for Shimon, for Leva. He has kavanah for the listener or for the listeners. Now, if it's just me and you, I will have kavanah for you. But a shliach tzibur has kavanah for everyone. The meiled includes even someone who you doesn't see. The date akula alma. Again, Toshima, another challenge against Rab Zera. Says in a Braisa, we learned this Braisa yesterday, neschavan hashemeya. If there's a blower and a listener, they both need kavanah. And the Braisa spells it out. If the listener had kavanah, but v'lo neschavan mashmiya. Similarly, in the opposite scenario, neschavan mashmiya v'lo neschavan shemeya. One of them had, but the other didn't. Lo yatsa. There's no mitzvah here. Ache yischavin shoymeya umashmiya. No. So what's the kasha? Oh, so says the Gemara. Since we juxtaposed, they both have to have kavanah, which implies that they both have to have a similar type of kavanah. Ketani mashmiya dumiya d'shemeya. Ma shemeya shemeya la'atzmai. When someone listens, what kavanah does he have? For himself. He has kavanah to listen to the shofar. Af mashmiya, should it not mean he only has to have kavanah for himself? In other words, if the mashmiya b'chlal has no kavanah, he's barking, he's making barking sounds, then it's not good. L'choyret means that as long as the mashmiya had in mind for him, the mashmiya is already good enough. As long as he had kavanah for himself, he doesn't need to have kavanah for the listener. And again, we are linking one topic with the other. So if I, the mashmiya, have to have kavanah for you means I'm blowing it for your mitzvah, then you have to have kavanah for you for sure, for mitzvah. If I don't, if mitzvah is ain't tzrichas kavanah and a chanami, then I don't have to have you in mind. Now the words v'katani lo yatsa, what I just spoke out, is the version that we have here on the side from the Hagoyis, from the Maharan Ranshenburg. I can even read it inside. V'katani lo yatsa nira be'enai d'tzoyna loimer lo yatsa im lo kiven lahashmiya la'atzmai lotzais lo yatsa if there was b'chlal no kavanah aval kiven la'atzmai if the mashmiya had in mind only for the mashmiya yatsa even though even if he did not have a mind to follow, that's a Tana. So Vakasha let Rab Zera, says the Gemara, you're right, that Rab Zera cannot be reconciled with this Braisa. And Enochanami, from this Braisa, we can conclude, if the Mashmiya Bechlal does not have to have in mind the other, the listener also doesn't have to have Kavanah for a mitzvah. This Braisa subscribes to that which we learned, Rava or Rabba or both, that mitzvah is ein tzrichas kavanah. But Rab Zera has from to lean on, because there is another Tana that clearly holds, as we'll see Rabbi Yossi, that mitzvahs need kavanah. Tanoihi, the Tanya, shemeya la'atzmai. No, he has to listen for himself. Now, what does it mean to listen for himself? You can learn this both ways. Either he has to have in mind for the mitzvah, but that's not the way we have to learn it. Let's go to what we learned yesterday. He has to have in mind to hear the sound. In other words, if he's misasek, if he just hears sounds, but he doesn't even know it's a shofar, it can be from an animal, that's not good. He has to make attention to he's listening to. Mashmiya even lifidarkoi. Mashmiya lifidarkoi means he doesn't have to blow for anyone. He can blow for himself. If you, by the way, heard, oichet good. All of this is the shita that mitzvahs don't need kavanah l'shem mitzvah. So less kavanah is needed. However, Amar Rabbi Yossi, and that will be the source of Rab Zera, that the mashmiya can be lefi darkoi. That's only if he's the shliach tzibur, because a shliach tzibur always has in mind the others. By the way, means he doesn't have to have in mind every single individual, because he has in mind already. His whole mission is to be a shliach of the tzibur. Aval biyachid lo yotzat she'ischaven shemeyo umashmiya. The fact that Rabbi Yossi says that if I blow for you, I have to have in mind you. Having in mind you means having in mind for you to fulfill your mitzvah. If again, the Kal V'chomer, if I, the enabler, have to have in mind that I'm blowing it for your mitzvah, avada, the listener has to have in mind l'shem mitzvah. So Rabbi Yossi is the Tana, Rabbi Zera is the Amoira, that hold that mitzvah tzrichas kavanah. I want to say bekitzer like this, that we generally paskin that by mitzvahs, you need to have kavanah if it's a biblical mitzvah. And one of the reasons why the poskim came to that conclusion is because we had yesterday, if you remember, that on the days, many questions against this concept. Like a person is reading the Torah in Kivan Liboy. Now, every time the Gemara gave a teretz, but it was a doichik. And you have to know how to learn Gemara, Aliyah the Hilchasa. When the Gemara has a raya from a Tana against what you're saying, and then the Amoira justifies it by really limiting the case of the Braisa. It's not mashma that way, or the Mishnah. So even though he's not refuted, but when it comes to halacha, sounds like from all of these Tanoim we learned yesterday that mitzvahs need kavanah, but the poskim say only by a biblical obligation. By rabbinic obligations, mitzvahs don't need kavanah. I'll give you one practical example that we all are familiar with. When it comes to the counting of the Omer, let's say tonight would be number 4. Place. And we're late in the afternoon, it's already at night. And then I want to tell my chaverim, like count 4. So they announce, last night was 3. Why do you have to say that? Say tonight is 4. When whoever says tonight is 4, he doesn't have kavanah with those words to fulfill the mitzvah. He doesn't have that kavanah. If mitzvahs need kavanah, say gesund hate. The whole reason why we are careful now, you said already 4, you count without a bracha. Why? Because you fulfilled the mitzvah. I didn't have kavanah to fulfill the mitzvah. Mitzvah's like tzrichas kavanah. It's a great example. But that's because most poskim hold, like we hold, that Sfiras Omer, before that we have the carbon Omer, is only midrabbanon. If it would have been midoiraisa and mitzvahs would need kavanah, then we would not be careful not to say tonight's number, and many other applications of this big machlekes. Okay. So moving on to the next Mishnah. We did have not only the big sugya of mitzvah tzrichas kavanah, but like we mentioned in the Mishnah that we had on Daf Chav Zayin on the Beis, we had
Rabbi.
Yes.
When you're saying number 4, you're not actually saying the prayer for the Omar and stuff. So
the
why
mitzvah,
does that suggest that you didn't need to have kavanah?
Baruch, the prayer that we say is amazing, but it is secondary to the mitzvah. The mitzvah is just a count. So even though I didn't make a blessing prior and that lengthy prayer was not said, if I counted the day, so again, if you have to have intent for the mitzvah, I did. When I notified my neighbor, I had no such intent. But if you don't need to have intent for the mitzvah, just count. I counted. Okay. We learned about kavanah. So it says the Mishnah, this is a very important, every Mishnah is important, but including this one. So let's go. When it says in the portion of Bishal, the first time we engaged with the Amalekim, and the Torah gives details how Moshe Rabbeinu was standing with both of his hands raised heavenward. And the Torah writes that when Moshe Rabbeinu lifted up his hands, then V'gavar Yisrael, the Yidden, the Jewish people, won over Amalek, etc. So the Mishnah says, what his hands were making the war or breaking the war. As long as the Jewish people were looking heavenward. And who inspires a Jew to look heavenward? The Rebbe. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu was inspiring us, and we were being makabel, that hashpam, we were looking up, and looking up, not only physically, but umishabdin es libam la'aviyim shebashamayim, and we would subjugate our hearts to Hashem. Then hoyum izgabrim, we would prevail. The imlav hoyum noiflim kayotze b'davar atoimer, and similarly we find later in Parshas Chukas, after a moment of us complaining to Hashem and to Moshe, as we said when we did Tshuva, Chatanu B'Hashem Vavach, and a fiery serpent, snakes came and were biting the Jewish people, and Moshe Rabbeinu was told by God, Asei l'chasarav, make for yourself a fiery serpent. Moshe Rabbeinu made it out of copper, because like Rashi says, Loshain, Noifel al Loshain, Lachash Nechoshes. But anyway, Hashem, make for yourself a fiery serpent. And v'sim oisei alanes, and put it on a pole. And this is quoting a verse. Whoever was already bitten, would simply look up at the pole and live. And many people in the medical field, like behind every ambulance, you'll have an image of this pole with Moshe Rabbeinu's snake around it. That is a reminder that God is the healer. You know what that symbol means? And again, the Mishnah says, and the way Chassidus teaches, the physical snake that bit you, what you think that poison is killing the person. It's just a shliach of a God. And it's the same thing, whether it's the physical snake's bite, whether it's the inanimate copper snake of Moshe. Same thing. You think that gave you life? Ella like this, when we look upwards, and therefore it's not only looking upwards. Many people, we look up to God. Yeah, I'm good at that. But poil mamish, you have to look up, and now now we have to subjugate ourselves. Got to bring it down in Hamaisu Hua Iked. Then we got healed. But if not, God forbid, we perished. Atkan da agadata. And that closes the topic of kavanah. And now the next clause of the Mishnah, which is the first halach of this Mishnah, is going to speak about who is able to blow shofar for another. Now, chedesh, first category of people mentioned in the Mishnah, normally means a deaf mute. A deaf mute person, up until recently, was considered in halacha someone who's mentally underdeveloped. We spoke out to speak out again that many poskim say that because of the advances today of humanity, that even if a person, God forbid, is deaf and mute, there are ways that we know how to communicate with him or her and vice versa, and they are not in the category of someone who's mentally incompetent. None of this has anything to do with this chedesh. This chedesh only means deaf. A person who's only deaf is mentally competent even in the times of the Mishnah. But the mitzvah of shofar, according to most Rishonim, and that's the way we paskin from the Nusach HaBracha, is lishmoya kol shofar. Whoever is unable to hear is exempt from the mitzvah. And the Mishnah is basically going to teach us this one rule, that if I am going to do a mitzvah for you, not all mitzvahs can I do for you. I cannot put on tefillin for you. We'll speak about this another time, exactly mitzvah shebaguf, not mitzvah shebaguf. Certain mitzvahs I can do for you, especially in mitzvahs where the mitzvah is to listen, to hear, or to say something, and there's a rule called shoymeya ka'oina. Shofar, the whole mitzvah is to listen, but the blower has to be someone who's also obligated to listen. If the blower is not obligated to listen and he blows it and the sound is there and someone else physically listens, they will not fulfill their obligation. So a chedesh who's exempt because Hashem created him in a way that he can't hear, but mainly he's exempt from this mitzvah, cannot blow the shofar for the other. A shaytan means a halachic imbecile, a halachic person who's mentally challenged. However you define that, it's not so simple. A shaytan is exempt from all the mitzvahs. A minor is exempt from all the mitzvahs. Why? Because they're haklal. Whoever is not obligated themselves cannot have the public fulfill their obligation. Okay, so now the Mishnah spoke who cannot. Let's learn who could. This begins the Braisa. Everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of the Kiyah Shofar. Who's the everyone? Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim. And even though this is not such a rare statement, but it has to be explained. Because if not Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim, then who would be obligated? Right, Yakir? It's almost like a pshita. The Gemara is going to explain. There's a chiddush in this line. Kohanim, Levim, and Yisrael. Gedim, converts. Va'avadim mishuchrarim, freed slaves, freed non-Jewish slaves, that after they are freed are a bona fide, full-fledged Jew. Tumtum is a person who was born with one's genitals covered. Now, a tumtum, in Torah, there is 2 or maybe 3 genders. A male and a female and a androgynous, someone who physically has both the genitalia of a male and a female. Now, a tumtum is either a male or a female. We don't know which. A woman is not obligated in the mitzvah of blowing shofar. So it goes without understanding, Yakir, that a tumtum cannot blow the shofar, because maybe the tumtum is a woman. More than that, not only can a tumtum not blow the shofar for a male, a tumtum cannot blow the shofar for another tumtum. Even though they're both called tumtums, but maybe the blower turns out to be female and the listener is male. An androgynous is also someone that either halachically has a din of a male or has a din of a female, or it's like a third gender. So an androgynous cannot blow it for a male, but an androgynous could blow it for another androgynous, because mimanavshach. If we are going to paskin that a androgynous is considered male, so he's male and he's male. If an androgynous is female, nothing happened. A woman is not obligated, but by the way, she gets the mitzvah if she hears it, and a woman can blow for a woman. Not this is obligated, not she is obligated. Okay, but an androgynous cannot blow the shofar for a male.
As opposed to tumtum, but what's the
One second. Listening. A tumtum has to listen, maybe he's male. An androgynous has to listen, maybe he's male. Maybe halacha considers an androgynous male gender. Good. Now, this is the final category in the Mishnah. For example, there are other. One example, someone was owned by 2 owners. A slave belonged to 2 people. One of them freed the slave. Halachically, he's called half free man, half slave. The tzad, a free man, has to listen to the shofar. However, that's about they are obligated to listen. But what about them doing it for the other? Here says the Braisa. We already spoke it out. Tumtum a tumtum cannot blow the shofar for a minoi, means for another tumtum. Why not? Like we said, because maybe the blower will turn out to be female and the listener is male. Nor can the tumtum blow it for as she'ena minoi, to a non-tumtum, meaning to a bona fide male. Why not? Because maybe this tumtum is female. An androgynous could blow the shofar for another androgynous, like we said, biman avshach. If halach is going to determine that an androgynous has the halachic status of male gender, that goes for all androgynous. The blower and the listener is good. If both of them are female, oichet good. But an androgynous cannot blow the shofar for a male, because maybe halacha will consider a androgynous a non-male, either a female or an androgynous, neither of which is chayiv in the mitzvah. The mitzvah is mechoyev only someone who's male. He for sure cannot blow the shofar for a full-fledged free yid. That's she'ena mina, a free. He cannot even blow the shofar to another chetzi ever chetzi b'chayim. Why not? Why not? Because when he blows the shofar, the tzad Eved that's blowing is part of making the sound. That side is not mechuyev. The listener, the tzad ben chayrin, has to hear the sound. It's not hearing it from a ben chayrin. It's hearing it part from a ben chayrin, part from an eved. We don't say that the tzad ben chayrin is blowing for the other recipient's tzad chayrin. We don't say that. The question will be, can he even blow it for himself? And we'll see a machlekas amaroim in a few lines from now. That logic will even say maybe he cannot even blow it for himself because the mitzvah is to listen. So when he's blowing, who's blowing it? All of him. So the tzad abdus is part of the blowing, and that is not good for the tzad chedus that has to listen.
Can they make a kavana to tap into the ben chayrin side?
So very good. So a good question. We don't say that, but what this is great. So
female blow for a female all format.
A female won't actually blow because. Let me say why a female would not blow for a female. And I'm happy you're going, but I want to correct myself. Because even though women are not mechuyev to listen to the sounds of the shofar, because this is a positive mitzvah that's time-bound, nevertheless, we paskin that if a woman opts to do a mitzvah, then she gets the mitzvah. But you know when she gets the mitzvah? When does she get the mitzvah? Again, if she blows it for herself, she'll get the mitzvah. But if she's going to blow it for someone else, that's the rule we learned in the Mishnah. If someone is not mechuyev b'davar, they cannot be moitzi the other. Okay. Everyone is obligated in the sounding of the shofar. Now, I know that sometimes this is not the only time, but this kasha goes on all the times. Why do you even have to mention that? No, there's a chiddush, even Evan Meshucher, I get it. But to say that Kahanim Levim Yisrael, if not them, then who? So the Gemara explains that the reason why the Braisa quoted Kahanim Levim in Yisraelim was not for the Yisraelim, but it's really for the Kahanim. It means Kahanim and Levim. And you would have thought that they're not mechuyev. Kahanim Yitzchak, I would have thought, since it says regarding the blowing of the shofar in Parshas Pinchas, Yom Teruah Yelochem, it shall be a day of blowing, which means today is unique. Today is the day of blowing. Which is all the Yisraelim, we are only obligated in blowing once a year, Rosh Hashana, who the Machayev. But you might have thought, they are many other times obligated to blow, as it says, now I know Chatzoitzros is not shofar, but let's put them together. Al oiloi sechem, guys, we know the pasuk. They blow it when they brought a carbon oila. They brought it by Yishlamim Chevra. They blew the chatzroitris every day with the Talmud, and they're obligated. So you would think emo loyali chayvu. So Kamash Malan, yeah, the Gemara says no, they're also mechoyev. Says the Gemara, no, that don't tell me that's a chiddush because me dummy. True that you have to blow trumpets, but that's trumpets. Here by Rosh Hashana and Parshas Pinchas it says Yom Teruah. No, I wouldn't have said. I would not have even had such a havamina. So again, the Gemara comes back. Ella Itzrach, yeah, Kohanim are needed. Why? I would have thought, since it says in a Mishnah, which we learned above, that what? That Shava, HaYovel, Rosh Hashana, both Litkiyam, whether the shofar is straight or bent, and to the brachas that are made on Yom Kippur, on Yovel. Why is that? We'll learn later, because this Tana holds of a Gzeira Shava. Once you have a Gzeira Shava, and Gzeira Shava Lamechza, we would have compared it completely, and therefore I would have perhaps said, Man the Iseh b'mitzvahs HaYovel, whoever subject to all the details of Yovel, all the details, is obligated in the blowing of the shofar on Yovel, and therefore obligated in Rosh Hashana. Iseh b'mitzvah Rosh Hashana. But we know that Kohanim, and we'll see in Leviim, Hoyel, V'leisnu, B'mitzvahs, Yovel, they are not part of all of the mitzvahs of Yovel. Azoi, what are they not part of? The Tran. Here we go. Kohanim and Leviim, Moichlim L'oilam. Moichlim L'oilam means that if you own a house in a walled city, if you own a house in a non-walled city, if you hold a Sadeh, whatever you own, you can sell no matter when. By the way, Yisraelim can always sell no matter when. The Chiddush is the next clause. But V'goy Alin L'oilam. They, unlike a Yisrael, can always redeem it. Let me make a kitzur of the Rashi over here. Din number one, if you remember, if a person sells a house, which is in a walled city, they can only redeem it for the first year. After the first year, the buyer gets to keep it forever. Number one. Din number two, when you sell a sadeh, the buyer gets to keep it for at least 2 years. After 2 years, the buyer can redeem it. Everyone is the same in the first Kohanim. Din number 3 is like this. If I was Magdish my field, I'm a Yisrael. First of all, I can redeem it until Yovel from the Beis HaMikdash, and it's a mitzvah for me to redeem it, because when I redeem it, I add a chodesh. But if I didn't redeem it, and you bought it from the Beis HaMikdash, you know what the halacha is? You get to keep it until Yovel. When Yovel comes, it never goes back to me. It goes back to the Kohanim that are serving then in the Beis HaMikdash. I cannot be goyelit anymore, the original owner. But if I would have been either a Kohen or a Levi, same thing, and I would have had ancestral land. People ask, how do they have it? They can have it. If they would have land, and they would be Magdash, same thing. And the Beis HaMikdash would sell it to someone else. And it would go back to the Kohanim on Yovel. The original owner can go and still buy it back. That's that Kohanim and Leviim, not like Yisraelim, they can be Goyel Oilam. Unlike the Israeli. In other words, we don't share all of the same rules. So you would have thought, Ema, the mitzvah, the Rosh Hashana, loyli chayva, guys, the wide, the medium-sized line, Komash Malan, that even the Kohen and the Levi are mechoiv in the mitzvah of Tkiyah Shofar. Right. Misha Chatzoi Eber V'Chatzoi Ben Choinim. Says the Baraisa, Eino Moitze, they cannot, they're obligated to listen. Why are they obligated to listen? Because the Tzad Ben Choirim has to hear. But they cannot blow it for someone else. Not only they cannot blow it to a bona fide ben choyden, they can't even blow it to another chatzi evet chatzi ben choyden. Lo yasminoi, and for sure, zu ve'ein tzarach loimer zu v'lo yeshe'ein aminoi. Says Rav Huna, the fact that the Brais is only speaking about for others is that he can blow it for himself. And here we say what Yakir was trying to say before. He's also chatzi evet chatzi ben choyden, because since it's the same person, here we say that the part of the abdus of his, that sound was only heard by the tzad abdus. We don't care. The tzad ben choyden was heard by the tzad ben choyden. Perfect match. Perfect match. Says Rav Nachman Rav Huna, I don't agree. If we can say that, say it even for the other, right? And if you don't say it for himself. Mishnah la'achedim deloi kama, because deloi yasi tzad abdus umafik tzad cherus. We say that his tzad abdus is part of the blowing. Every part of the blow has in it some tzad abdus, which is why the listener, even the tzad ben choyden, is also hearing from tzad abdus. That's the way we are saying. So therefore, based on that logic, la'atzmei nami loy asi tzad abdus didei umapik tzad cherus didei. And he argues with Rav Huna, and he says, Elo Amar Rav Nachman af la'atzmai eina moitze. So now that we have a machlokes amiroim, the second to last line in Amud Aleph, Kanya nami hachi like Rav Nachman. And normally that would mean, not like, by the way, and halachic to be paskin like it. Sometimes the Gemara says to Yufta the Rav Huna, whether he could have found an answer or not, but this Brais is clearly like Rav Nachman, Mi shechetz yoy evet, the chetz ben choyden, okay, so the Mishnah was speaking about the specific mitzvah of blowing the shofar, and the Mishnah gave a rule, which is a beautiful rule, simple, logical, easy to remember. Now let's broaden the topic. Forget about not only for shofar. There are many other mitzvahs, not all mitzvahs. Again, I have to eat matzah. I can't eat matzah for you. I cannot keep Shabbos for you. But there are many mitzvahs based on the principle of Shemea Ko'ina. Let's focus specifically if it's a mitzvah that you have to say or hear something, right? Midrabanan, you have to hear the Megillah. Okay, you have to read the Megillah. You have to read the Megillah. The bracha is reading, but because of the rule that a listener is like a responder, so if you hear my reading, you read. I can read for you. That I am obligated. So the question will be, what happens if I already read it? But let's first speak about Doiraisis. The Gemara will conclude at the end, the same as Bedrabanan. What will be a biblical obligation that I have to say? A biblical obligation would be saying the words of Kiddush and davening. Very good. Saying the words of Kiddush, not the brach of wine that we'll discuss in a moment. Saying the words. Everyone has to say it. But if I said it for you, Shemea Ko'ina. But if I already said it, I fulfilled my obligation. If I'm not obligated now, this Shabbos to make Kiddush, you can l'choira argue, I can no longer make it for you. Because the Mishnah says, Kol she'einu mechuyev b'davar, einu moitzes ram dechavasan. Says the Gemara, not exactly. This is an Avos Yisrael Gemara. There's a rule of arvus, meaning one Jew is the guarantor for all of the other Jews. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh bozeh, which means that if you did not fulfill your obligation, neither did I, because you didn't. So I'm still mechuyev b'davar. So Taneh, Ahava, Berei, the Rav Zera, isn't it beautiful that the name of the Tana or the Amoida that's quoting the Braisa is Ahava? His name was love, because Arvus is a concept based on Avos Yisrael. The Tana Ahava, Berei, the Rav Zera, Kol Abrocha Yiskulam. Afal Pi Sheyatza. A person fulfilled his obligation because they already said that bracha. Now, we're speaking about the bracha. We're not using the word mitzvah. I want to say that because in many mitzvahs, I can never do it for you. You got to do it for yourself. But words, generally, still moitzi. I can do it for you. Rashi, 7 lines from the bottom. I'm not mechoyev, Zakt Rashi, Sharei, Kol, Yisrael, Arevim, Zeh, Bozel, Mitzvahs. What is the big exception? Birchas Hanehenin. The example that we give in this Braisa, it's just an example. Chutz mi birchas alechem, eha moitzi lechem in haaretz. We're not speaking about. We're speaking about the stam when I eat bread, or when I make a bracha over wine. Rashi adds clearly. Rashi 5 lines from the bottom, and all the other brachas that you make on fruits, brachas that you make for a cent. If I did not yet, if I'm drinking wine, I have to make a hagefen. I can make it for you. But if I already made the bracha for me, and now you want to drink wine, you don't know how to make the bracha yet. I can't make it. If I myself did not fulfill my obligation, then yes, moitzi. I'm mechoyev b'davar, you're mechoyev b'davar. But once I fulfilled my obligation, einoi moitzi, I cannot cause you to fulfill yours. Says Rashi, guys. Let's read Rashi, the last Rashi in Chav Tes Amud Aleph, 5 lines from the bottom. V'shor habrachos, peiros, and reichonei she'einon choyva. He's emphasizing, don't confuse Kiddush with this, as the Gemara will speak about in a moment. Elo, what's birchas hanehenin? I'm not obligated to eat. Who told you to eat? The Torah says, Chazal said, you're not allowed to have benefit from the world without making a bracha. That's, in other words, you can say the bracha is not a mitzvah. We call that the bracha is a matir. It allows you to eat. Elo she'asur li hanois min ha'olam azeh v'lei bracha. Ubezu, says Rashi, ein kan arvus, because she'ein choyva al ha'adam. Loyli hisnani, habnish kanano, and v'loy livrich machnish kamrach. So that's why I can only be moitzi you if I still have to do it for myself. So now the question is, boya, either Rava or again we have from the Girsa of the Rosh and the Rif, boya rachava. So an Amoira asked the following inquired Daf Chav Tes Amud Beis. What about birchas alechem shel matzah? In other words, there's 2 brachas that we make when we eat matzah. One bracha is asher kedishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu lechol matzah. That al achilas matzah. Thank you. That bracha I can make for you, even if I made it for me. I already ate my kezayis or my 2 kezayis and I made a ka'ara. I can make that bracha. That's no question, because Kol Yisrael arevim. But the hamoitzi part, can I make it for you now? We just said chutz mi birchas alechem. Yeah, that's birchas alechem when there's no mitzvah to eat. Here, there's a mitzvah to eat the matzah, which also demands of you to make the birchas hanehenin bracha or ubirchas hayayin shel kiddush hayoyim. What's the kiddush part of kiddush? The mekadesh Shabbos. Of course, I can make for you, even though I made it for me. But what about the boida priyagofen part of kiddush? I already made kiddush. Can I make that also for you? And the Gemara speaks on both sides. Do we say kibam the choyvahu mapik? Yeah, it's an obligation. That makes the birchas hanehenin also an obligation. Oidilma, no, we have a rule that bracha lav choyvahi. Since the birchas hanehenin part elsewhere is not obligated, even when there is a chiyuv, we separate these 2. So Tashema, this is not from a Tana. This is just what we call from what happens out there. That we know the Omar Ravashi. That ki havinan bei Rav Papi have a mikadishlan. I saw we were in his house. He was the host. He made kiddush. Note sometimes we don't say shemei ha'koina by kiddush. Actually, we apply shemei ha'koina. That's the normal that one person makes kiddush for everyone, at least for his family. Here for his talmidim, they listen to the kiddush of Rav Papi. But the chihava asari semidabra. Rav Papi had sharecroppers. Yidden. They worked for him. These were the people that they worked until when they were allowed to work. In other words, when they finally came into the house, of course, the meal by the Papi began right after Shabbos. They came 15 minutes late. Came in working people. They worked as long as they could. Have a mekadosh. He made kiddush again, including the Bayre Priyagofen. And so we paskin. Tan Rabbanim says the Braisa, Lo yifreis adam prusa lo orchem elam kein oichel imam. That if you have guests and you want to break bread, the breaker of the bread is the one that makes the bracha. You make the bracha and you break the bread. We actually prefer for the host to break the bread because during the times of limited resources, an oirech would be afraid to take a big piece and to give others a big piece. At least most people feel that it's not mine. He went for the balabas, but he would give everyone a big piece. He would make the bracha. He cannot make the bracha for them unless he's eating with them, as we learned. He can't make the hamoitzi for them. That's just the expression. Whoever made the hamoitzi was the one that broke the bread. And by the way, al pi Kabbalah, whoever makes the hamoitzi needs to eat the bread first, even though it doesn't look nice. Many people want to be nice. They make the bracha and they cut it up and they share the bread and they eat it all together. Like, don't be a chaper. No. If you make the bracha, eat it right away and then cut up for everyone else. But there's one exception, and that is that if I have a child, or if I see your child does not yet know how to make birchas hanehen, and I am not eating, or if I already made a bracha for me, I make the bracha for the child. It's not a bracha levatala. Again, this is a ma'aseh b'chol yom. We have a small kindalach. The parent macht the brachas, the whole bracha. You make, now, when they get older, they only need a reminder for the end. Fine, then let them say Shem Hashem. But when they're very young, even though I'm not eating, or I ate and I made a bracha for me, I make a bracha for a child because of chinuch. And the final din in the Braisa is the rule above that what? Of arvus isn't only by biblical obligations, but even when it comes to Hallel, even when it comes to Megillah, afal pishiyotza. I already recited Hallel. I already read the Megillah. I am allowed to be Moitziu. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebozeh also applies to Midrabanons. And with that we say, Hadran Allah Ru'u Bezdin. We will come back to you, Perek Shlishi, and Chevra Freilach. We are starting the 4th chapter. So the whole beginning of the 4th chapter is about the rule that we are familiar with, that if Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos, when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos, even though, as we'll see, mid the oirai, so you have to always blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana. Chazal have a koyach, for a reason that they have, or for reasons that they have. And indeed, there is a rabbinic takana which has an exception, but their general rule is shofar is not blown. Says the Mishnah, Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashana. If the Yom Tov falls on Shabbos, Taka b'migdash, they will blow the shofar. Zakt Rashi, machlokes rishonim here. B'migdash means only in the Migdash, not even in Yerushalayim. Avoloi b'Medina, look inside Rashi. Loi b'Medina, loi b'Yerushalayim, and certainly not in the boundaries outside Yerushalayim. Now we're going to see in the end of the Mishnah a statement that is the opposite of this, but we'll have to explain. But first, the Mishnah says that the shofar is only blown in the Mikdash. However, mi shechara beis hamikdash. No, shechara beis hamikdash, no beis hamikdash. So if we're never going to blow the shofar on Shabbos, we will forget that in the Beis HaMikdash the shofar is blown. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived during the Churban, was the one that famously made many takanas zecher lemikdash. And Chavra zecher lemikdash doesn't only mean to remember how things used to be. The ikir is to know how things will be. So he said, Beis HaMikdash his Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sheyu toiken b'chol makom sheish by Beis. Version number one, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai didn't only say to blow the shofar in the Great Sanhedrin, which outlived the Churban hundreds of years. Even if it's not the Great Sanhedrin, even if it's a Beis Din of 23, not a Beis Din of 3, of 23, many places blew the shofar in a Beis Din. Amar Rabbi Elazar, you have the wrong version. I know that he made a takana, but his takana was only for the Great Sanhedrin. Well, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Ella b'Yavna. Yavna is just an example. The Sanhedrin didn't only go to Yavna. The Sanhedrin went 10 times into exile. Final place was Tiberia before the Romans took it apart. But he means only where the Great Sanhedrin is, the Sanhedrin Gedol. Weiter, Omru Loi, and they responded to Rabbi Lazar, no, Echad Yavna ve'echad kol makom sheyesh by Beis Din. And the Gemara is going to ask, why the repetition? Right? The Mishnah doesn't say, Amar Rabbi Elazar, loy. Okay, you wrote both opinions. Why do you have to have the comeback? He's not adding a svara, he's just saying nisht. Okay. Gemara will say. Now, there's something that Yerushalayim has more of a Yavna. The Mishnah didn't even mention one thing yet. But what's the first thing that Yerushalayim has more over Yavna? The Mishnah didn't write. The Gemara is going to say what it is. Any city, not in Yerushalayim, listen to the criterions, that can see Yerushalayim, the Gemara is going to clarify, that can hear Yerushalayim, that is near Yerushalayim, that can come to Yerushalayim. Well, every statement is a statement. We'll leave it for the Gemara. Then they blow the shofar, meaning that even though it's Shabbos, just like in Yerushalayim, they blew the shofar. Hello, we learned in the beginning of the Mishnah they didn't blow. We'll get to that in a moment. But just like they will blow the shofar in the whole Yerushalayim, then that includes all of these surrounding close cities. But that's only by Yerushalayim. But when the Sanhedrin moved to Yavne, yes, they blew it over there in the Sanhedrin. Not in the city of Yavne, and for sure not in the surrounding cities. So here again, we have the big contradiction. The Mishnah began, L'shita Rashi, Loi b'Medina. Loi b'Medina says Rashi, they did not blow the shofar in Yerushalayim. The Mishnah ends by telling you, no, not only did they blow it in Yerushalayim, they even blew it in the cities that were Roya, Shemas, Kreva, V'chayel Lavai. So Chevra, this is the way you learn the Mishnah. When the Sanhedrin sat the way they should in the Lishkas Hagazis, in the chamber, in the Beis HaMikdash, they only blew it in there. Prior to the Churban, that's just what happened. The Romans moved the Sanhedrin out of that chamber. But one of their first new homes was still in Yerushalayim at HaKodesh. As long as the Sanhedrin was in Yerushalayim at HaKodesh, now that you're not in the Beis HaMikdash, they would blow the shofar in the whole Yerushalayim on Shabbos, not only in Yerushalayim, in the whole city, but even in the cities nearby. When the Sanhedrin moved out of Yerushalayim, then we went back to only blowing it in the Sanhedrin proper. After the Churban, now we have this machlokes in the Mishnah. Taked Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says that Toikin either b'chol mokim sheyesh beis din, or Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that you continuously blow it even after the Churban, only in the Sanhedrin. Okay, says the Gemara Minohan Amili, which means how do we know that the shofar is not blown if Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos? Really, the question is it midoraisa or is it midrabanan? And the first attempt is to say it's midoraisa. Amar Rabbi Levi bar Lachamo, Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina. I'll tell you, Kosav Echadoimer, Pashas Emoir, Shabbosoin, Zichroin Teruah. It's a day of rest, Rosh Hashana, a day that you remember. Remember means you don't blow it, you remember. For Kosav Echadoimer, Yom Teruah Yelochem. Hello, do you blow it or do you remember blowing it? Stira. So, his approach was that mid the oiraisa, it's only zichroin teruah, and kan the pasuk in Parshas Pinchas yom teruah is beyond of shechaliyas b'chol. To which comes Rav and says to his colleague, to Rabbi Levi bar Lachman, nisht can be that mid the oiraisa, if the oivishter did not want us to blow shofar shechaliyas b'Shabbos, then the Mikdash Hechi Taki Inon. How can they go on the Beis HaMikdash? Now, whether you're goyres the word va'oid or not goyres the word va'oid, but let's read what we have in our va'oid. Why would it be yasin midoraisa? Halav melachi, it's not considered labor for the Torah to need to make this contradiction, to make it clear that you don't need to blow. The Itzrakla Lema'ute. It's not labor, the Tana, the Shmuel. When it says, Kol Meleches Avoida Leisasu. By the way, Kol Meleches Avoida Leisasu is written by Yantif, but a similar expression is written by Shabbos many times, Kol Melacha, Shabbos and Yantif. You shall not do, look at the words, not Avoida, not Melacha, Meleches Avoida. You see how it's a double lashon. Don't do laborious work. What is God saying? He's trying to tell you only laborious work. Other works you could do. And the example is this. So that excludes what's not forbidden, Tkiyah Shofar. What's not forbidden biblically. Rediyas Apas is that when they would put bread in the oven, So then the removing of the bread off the oven, the pita breads were stuck on the walls of the inside of the oven. Removing it, if the Torah only would have written, don't do malacha or don't do avoida, when it says melechas avoida, that's not melechas avoida. Anything that demands skill, and if you have the skill, it's relatively easy, that's not melechas avoida. You're not prohibited midoiraisa, shehi chachma, it's considered a skill. People know how to blow the shofar, they don't even lose their breath. If you're losing your breath, you're not doing it correctly. Or maybe you're doing it because you're trying to make it very loud for a big shul to hear, but you can blow the shofar in a way that it's very easy. And similarly, the dias apas, it's a skill. The ein malach, it's not the labor. So why would it be usher? And therefore, Ella Amar Rava, no, midoraisa mishli sharei, you are allowed to blow the shofar on Shabbos. V'rabbanan hu the gazer beit. And that is as Rabbah taught us. This is known as Gezerah de Rabbah. When we began Beitza, we learned Hachana de Rabbah. This is known as Gezerah de Rabbah. He didn't make up this Gezerah. The Mishnah spoke about it. He was the one that taught us this rule. This the Rabbanan, the Amar Rabbah. Hakoil chayovim b'tkiya shofar. However, ve'ein hakol b'kiyim b'tkiya shofar. The fact is that many people don't know how to properly make the sounds, and therefore there is a real fear, gezeda, shema yitlenu b'yadai, that a person who doesn't have privy, who doesn't have a shul nearby, the Aaron Bachrim going with Tzayim nearby, he understands, ein adavar tali elabi, I have to blow it for myself. I have a kasha, how to blow it. He might end up taking the shofar b'yelech eitzel habakin, or go to the expert, lilmoid, to learn how to properly do it, and inadvertently, by mistake, v'yavirenu dal damas b'neshus harabim.
Why is no one talking about the sound to make a Shabbos?
Making a sound on Shabbos, Chava, we just learned that it's only Asr Midrabanan. We already learned that, and the only Asr Midrabanan is because of you might fix the instrument. It's also Midrabanan. Very good. There's no Isra D'Oraisa to make sound. And V'hainu Tamad Lula, V'hainu Tamad Megillah. And as we learn in Chassidus, such a great mitzvah. You're not going to end up doing Midrabanan. Yes, they have the koyach, the sheval tasa, to tell you don't do it. Parenthetically, the Chachamim have a power to tell you to do something also against the Torah, but it's very rare that they use that. Sheval Taisa is more common. The answer is Al Pi Chasidus. But there has to be a reason Al Pi Nigla. But whatever shofar accomplishes, Shabbos accomplishes. So the Ruchni is the kahashpa that comes through the shofar, you're not losing. And that's the way that Rebbe explains why they never made that gezeda when it comes to Pesach for the Seder. You don't know how to blow the shofar. There's so many more dinim of the Seder that people don't know. So why were they not afraid? You have a matzah that's bent. There's some flour in it. Is it a kazayas? Is it got to a bit chametzik? Is this considered muttered? Is this a kois? There's so many questions by the Seder, but since Baruch Nisayanyanim, that which the Seder accomplishes, even Shabbos does not accomplish, they never made the Gezeder. Let's go weiter. Let's hop another few lines of it. He's going to be and Zakai. Again, the two versions. The first version is to blow it in any place there is a base. Listen to the story. We'll finish with a Maisa. After the Churban, Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos. Now, in the Beis Hamikdash, and as we learned in the Mishnah, as we spoke out at the end of the Mishnah, even when the Sanhedrin moved out of the Lishkas Hagazis, when the Beis Hamikdash was standing, people used to go to Yerushalayim to hear the shofar. Then they were allowed to blow the shofar in the whole city. So after the Churban, people came to Yavna to hear the shofar. Kol ha'adam Wisconsin. He wanted to get a consensus that we should blow it. Lebnei Beseda, that nitka, lomer blows in the shofar. So they responded, whoa. Nadun, let us deliberate. What's the question over here? I'll tell you what the question is. The question is, even though, what's the fear of Rabbah? People might end up carrying it. Now, tragically, it could have been that the Sanhedrin would be so weak as an institution that if they would blow the shofar in the Sanhedrin, even there someone might end up carrying. So let's see whether we should not apply Gezeda de Rabbah in Yavna. So Amar Lahem Rabbi Yechanan says, I hear your issue, but you know what? First nitka. We know we have the koyach. We're going to make sure no one will carry. Let's blow now. Whether forever we should blow, then we'll deliberate. So Bnei Beseda understanding that Rabbi Yechanan ben Zakkai only wants to blow this year, said, fine, now we'll blow. Once they blew, so then they told Rabbi Yechanan, Nadun. He told them too late. The horn was already heard in Yavna. People already saw that you blow it where the Sanhedrin is. You don't refute after something already happened. In other words, if Rabbi Yechanan ben Zakkai would have told him, let's blow always where there's a Sanhedrin, which is what he said, there would have been a lot more pushback. He said, let's do it right now. Once they did it, and that's the Hasidus, that the koyach of Amaisa is so powerful that when you hear a Torah, sometimes it will not inspire you enough and you'll have a kasha on the Torah. But when you hear a story, Sipuri Tzadikim, they are the biggest power. Ein Meshivan. That's it. That's the way we educate our kids. That's the way they're going to have a real Yirei Shamayim. By Zog and Mises, Chavre, God willing to be continued. Huh?
I want to break a record by finishing top off in one day. I'm almost sure.
Okay. Oh, right.